So today I want to talk about the 6 recollections. Um, these are a set of practices that were taught by the Buddha, and they're found both in the Pali and the Sanskrit traditions. So I actually started talking about these a few months ago in the BBCs, and I gave talks about the first 3 recollections: recollection of the Buddha, of the Dharma, and of the Sangha. And then during the winter retreat, I gave talks about other subjects. So I'd like to return to the 6 recollections and finish them. So today I'll talk about the fourth, which is the recollection of ethics. And the Buddha spoke about these in the Pali canon. So one sutra called the Uposatha Sutra. The Buddha is giving advice to a lay disciple about what to do on Uposatha. Uposatha is the term for new moon and full moon, those days related to the lunar cycle. So those are days on which we do additional extra virtuous activities. And so the Buddha is advising the disciple to practice these 6 recollections. He says this is a way to bring peace and joy into the mind and also to cleanse the defiled mind. So for this fourth one, the recollection of ethics, the Buddha says, a noble disciple recollects his or her own virtuous behavior as unbroken, flawless, unblemished, unblotched, freeing, praised by the wise, ungrasped, leading to concentration. When a noble disciple recollects their virtuous behavior, their mind becomes placid, joy arises, and the defilements of the mind are abandoned in the same way that a dirty mirror is cleansed by exertion. So here it seems that the Buddha is talking about Aryas because he uses the expression noble disciples. Aryas are those who attained a direct realization of emptiness. So they're pretty high level, and their ethics are really pure and flawless. But I think that even if we're not Aryas, we can still do this practice and bring to mind our own practice of ethical conduct, for example, keeping precepts, and then feel happy, feel joyful, rejoice that we are living in such a way. So I think that even if you've only taken 1 or 2 of the precepts, like refraining from killing and stealing and so forth, or even if you haven't yet taken any of the precepts, but you still feel committed to living a life that is non-harmful, that you're avoiding harmful, non-virtuous actions as much as you can and creating virtue as much as you can, because that's the meaning of ethics in Buddhism. So I think we all have some level of practice of ethics in our lives. So I think we can just focus on that and do this practice of rejoicing in our own virtue. And in case any of you think that that sounds kind of conceited and arrogant, like, oh, I'm so good, I'm so pure, I'm so holy, not like those people who don't live this way. So it's not like that. That's not the meaning. So instead, it's based on understanding and having confidence in cause and effect or karma. Yeah, so everything, all impermanent phenomena operate by this law of causes and conditions giving rise to results. And so karma has to do with our behavior. So when we do non-virtuous or harmful actions, we're creating suffering for others, but also for ourselves. And when we do virtuous, beneficial actions, we're creating the cause of happiness for others and for ourselves. And so if we look at what we're doing and we can see that we are creating virtue, we are creating the cause of happiness and trying to avoid non-virtue, the cause of suffering, as much as possible, that's really wonderful. It's fantastic. So we should be happy about it and kind of give ourselves a pat on the back and give ourselves encouragement to keep living this way. So Joseph Goldstein, in one of his books on mindfulness, says that doing this practice strengthens our self-confidence and self-respect and reminds us that we can indeed train the mind, that we can discern which actions are wholesome and which are not wholesome. But unfortunately, we don't always feel that way. Maybe because of the negative bias of the mind, or the brain rather, that neuroscience talk about. Instead of recognizing the good that we're doing, we sometimes focus on the bad, the faults and the mistakes. And then we can end up beating ourselves up and feeling guilty and feeling hopeless and so on. So if we're not careful and we continue doing that, that could lead to discouragement, and we might even abandon our practice thinking, oh, this is just too hard, or I can't do it. So of course it is good to acknowledge mistakes that we make and do purification practice. But once we have purified those mistakes and really committed ourselves to avoid doing them again, then we should feel confident that we've cleaned up that mistake and we can move on and stop feeling guilty and ashamed. And we need to remember the good things that we're doing, focus on that. So I think this practice is particularly powerful. And another thing that we need to watch out for is thoughts or feelings that ethical conduct, like keeping precepts, is restrictive, and we feel like we're bound up by chains, and that we might be happier if we didn't have these restrictions. So if those kind of thoughts pop up in the mind, be careful. Don't let your mind go down that road. And one way to remedy that would be to go back in time. Remember the life you had before you started learning the Dharma and living ethically and keeping precepts and so on. So what was that like? Were you happier then? Were you really a happier person then than you are now? And were you really free? Or were you under the control of afflictions, attachment and aversion, self-centeredness, and so on, and of course ignorance. So it's good to do a reality check on that kind of thought and see if it's valid or not. And I also think it's good to reflect on the benefits of ethics, especially keeping precepts. Because it said that if we have precepts, even just one precept in our mind, then continuously, every minute, every second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, virtue is being created, even when we're asleep, and we wouldn't break them anyway. So it's pretty amazing to think about that. Some of us have a few hundred precepts in our mind. And so that means we're creating heaps of virtue, good karma around the clock, even when we're just sitting here now listening to this talk. And then other benefits of ethics and keeping precepts are, of course, creating the cause for good rebirths in future lives, being assured of a fortunate rebirth rather than in the unfortunate realms. And then longer term liberation and eventually enlightenment, Buddhahood. In addition to the long-term benefits, there are benefits we can experience here and now in this very life. Our mind will be more peaceful and calm and easier to meditate, not so distracted by all these kinds of thoughts about the mistakes we've been making, the non-virtues we've been creating. Our relationships with others will be smoother, more harmonious. They also say keeping good ethics is a protection from harm. And we were just talking at breakfast yesterday or today about Abbey Monastery in California. And there was a fire, one of these forest fires approaching it, and it got right up to the border, the edge of the monastery, and then it stopped and even retreated. So there are stories like that, and I think that shows the power of keeping pure ethics. Living purely can be protection from harm. And also it said that even the place where we live will become peaceful and prosperous. So there's some really nice words from Joseph Goldstein in his book about ethics, so I'd like to read those. So the term for ethics in Pali and Sanskrit is shila or sila. I'm not sure how to pronounce it properly. And so he says there's different ways of doing this practice of recollection of shila. First, we recognize the beauty and power in those moments of restraint from unwholesome actions. What is the quality of our mind when we protect life rather than destroy it? When we take an insect outside rather than killing it? Can we pay attention to the feeling of empowerment that arises when we refrain from some kind of harmful or useless speech, or when we act with integrity in situations where that might be in conflict with our desires? At all these times, we can recognize the feeling in the mind as we make choices that are in accord with our values, feeling the qualities of great interest and joy in the Dharma. And then he talks about another way we could reflect on ethics or shila, and that is to look back over our lives, particularly from the time we consciously commit to wise action, and appreciate the fact that we are directing our lives in this way. In one verse of the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, "Happiness is virtue lasting through old age." Some of us are trying to do that. We're getting there. Remember that the practice of shila involves training, not commandments. Yeah, so many of us have been brought up in another tradition that has commandments laid down by God. So it's very different in Buddhism. The Buddha never said, you must do this or you will be punished. But instead, he just offered these practices, and we are totally free to choose them or not. So we take on the practice of ethics. We take on precepts voluntarily. So it's important to remember that this is our choice. And that even after lapses, we can retake the precepts and begin again. So with lay precepts, if you do break them, you can retake them. And in the case of our monastic precepts, the serious ones can't be retaken, but if we do break some of the minor ones, we can purify them at posada. So we can always start again. This enables us to appreciate all the times we have lived by this commitment to non-harming, and it also allows us to learn from those times that we haven't. So even when we do make mistakes, which is inevitable, we're just human beings, we're not Buddhas. We need to accept that we are going to make mistakes, but that's not the end of the world. We can learn from our mistakes and try to do better next time and slowly grow. So I think this is a really wonderful practice to remember and rejoice in our virtue, the virtue that we ourselves create. It's a way of giving ourselves encouragement and also increasing self-confidence and self-respect and joy, the joy in having this opportunity, which is very, very precious.